Hi everyone, my name is Marcin Jerzewski. I'm Marcin Król Fellow with Visegrad Insight, and I invite you to learn more about the ramifications of the Trump-Xi summit for Taiwan and Central Europe.
Welcome to the Visegrad Insight podcast.
We bring you global experts on the future of democracy, security, and economy.
The leading voices from Central Europe and on Central Europe.
Hosted by editors of Visegrad Insight.
Powered by Respublika Foundation from Warsaw, Poland.
Hello, we're recording this podcast on the 18th of May 2026. It's Monday, early morning in Warsaw, midday in Taipei. My name is Wojciech Przybylski. I'm editor-in-chief of Visegrad Insight, and I'm joined by Marcin Jerzewski, head of the Office of European Values think tank office in Taipei, and Marcin Król, fellow at Visegrad Insight. Hello, Marcin.
Hello, Wojciech. Thank you for having me on the show.
Naturally, we're expecting you to give us account of the recent visit between a meeting between the two leaders, the American president and the Chinese leader. Donald Trump has accomplished what exactly during this visit that was just concluded over the weekend and has been observed globally with much interest for various reasons. But what's your initial take after the visit?
Absolutely. The visit plays an important role for observers, whether in Taipei or in Washington or in Warsaw. Donald Trump is seeking to find new momentum in relations with China. However, China has made it explicitly clear that it no longer sees itself only as a rising power, not only as an aspiring contender to play a more pronounced role in global power arrangements, but rather as an equal to the United States that seeks to very assertively define its sphere of influence. Of course, if we look at official readouts, there is a very long laundry list of alleged successes of this visit. For example, new economic deals in agriculture, very important ahead of the midterms, but whether they will really transpire into something more substantive remains to be seen.
We've seen a number of commentators, and especially those experts in the United States, focusing both on the domestic impact for the domestic US politics, but also they've been looking at the key dynamics of rivalry for global power, as America's role as a hegemon, benevolent hegemon, some say, is now looking at the power, the rise of China as a power that is a contender for the division of the world or influence in the world on, some say, equal basis, and some say already in ways that America cannot challenge because they stem from exponential growth of economic power that Beijing also sees primarily through the political lens. So this is not about simply economy and business. This is not doing good business, as we've heard from this visit from statements of Donald Trump. This is economic statecraft. What's your read on the level of, let's say, understanding of what is really at stake in those comments that we are reading or we are hearing when it comes to the global power play?
Absolutely. China has been able to pull a lot of strings when it comes to its role in global supply chains for strategic technologies. And we have seen it very clearly in communications from the American side when they were setting the agenda for this interaction. When we speak about China's ability to project its economic statecraft, one of the shared areas of concern that we witness on both sides of the Atlantic are critical raw materials. So critical access to rare earths has been one of the key issues on the agenda. But I believe that the understanding of importance of economic issues in the engagements between US and China is quite different due to a divergent time horizon that is used to understand these dynamics by respectively Washington and Beijing. Indeed, one of the biggest successes, as declared by Washington, of this summit were new deals in agriculture, for example, the expansion of 2025 Chinese commitments to purchase more soybeans. That's an extension of a deal that was already struck in Busan last year. There is also a negotiation about reopening market access for US beef. However, these are issues that might seem very important in the context of short-term political game in the United States ahead of midterms, when the economic situation of farmers is particularly dire. That also reflects the pressure that Donald Trump is facing from farm state Republicans within his own party. But for China, these dealings are actually a very low-cost concession that they are making as a part of the broader strategic diversification. For example, specifically on food, China passed new legislation on food security that elevates the importance of food security discussions to the level of national security issues, placing diversification at the core of its strategy of risk mitigation. So actually, this is to the benefit of Chinese national security interests, as it helps with diversification away from Brazil as the primary provider of agricultural commodities. So this is what I mean when I mention these divergent time horizons. China was able to open the door on issues that ultimately still benefit its own national interest, allowing Donald Trump to paint it as a big victory, even if it is only a very temporary concession ahead of the midterms.
Right. That is, of course, the evaluation from within the United States that we read or hear about in the commentary, and there are numerous excellent commentaries on that. But we also talk in the context of what Europe should do. There is a global challenge of China rising in the sense of a non-democratic state actor imposing their footprint on the global rules and on the global conflicts. In the context of the visit of Donald Trump in Beijing, we thought they will be talking about Iran. That was much expected. Less expected, but important for both China and US is the continuous support of Beijing to Moscow to support Moscow's diplomatically and financially and through technological means in its onslaught on Ukraine, further undermining Europe, but also engaging US in the theater of that war and pulling the attention away from the competition in the Pacific. And finally, but perhaps primarily from the position where you are right now, is Taiwan and the question of the dominance over this tiny island, an independent democracy next to the shores of the People's Republic of China. How do we connect these points? Where we should be looking at in terms of what this visit has brought, if any, was GOG moving one or other direction as you look at the statements and achievements of the meetings.
Thank you for this broad question. And as I attempt to connect the dots, as you encourage me to do, let me start from Taiwan. Before the summit, a number of pundits, whether in Taipei, in Washington, or even across Europe, have been asking whether Trump would really be capable of trading off Taiwan for some sort of deal with China. I believe that after the summit, we don't really see a clear indication of a clear change in US policy vis-a-vis Taiwan. The consistency of US approach to supporting the democratic island democracy has been voiced quite clearly by other members of the delegation, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Nevertheless, in order to understand what transpired in Beijing, I believe it's useful to zoom in on a very Chinese concept of discourse power. In Mandarin, it's referred to as 话语权. So an alternative translation of this term would be the right to speak. And discourse power has traditionally been a very important element of China's quest to project its power more effectively in global affairs. It effectively refers to China's ability to set agendas and impose its framing on our understanding, as in the global community's understanding of global dynamics. And we have seen China's efforts to deploy its discourse power, for example, in its responses to Russia's full-scale aggression against Ukraine. The peace plan that China put together with partners such as Brazil was a manifestation of its attempt to project discourse power. And I believe that the language that Donald Trump used to describe the current state of affairs in the Taiwan Strait demonstrates the effectiveness of China's discourse power, because Trump spoke in a very dangerous way about the 1982 six assurances, one of which states that the United States should not involve Beijing in negotiations over arms sales to Taiwan. One of the most controversial statements made by President Donald Trump following the visit was that whether arms sales to Taiwan will continue is still on the table. So again, if they do not continue because of advice from Beijing, that would go against the six assurances. But on top of that, we also saw Trump regurgitate some of the Chinese framing of who President William Lai and his Democratic Progressive Party really are and what they stand for, because the Democratic Progressive Party, just like the major opposition, the Kuomintang, are parties of the status quo. Nevertheless, Trump reemphasized that he would hate to see Taiwan go independent, even though formal declaration of independence is not a part of the party's platform. And President Lai has reiterated repeatedly, most recently just yesterday on Sunday the 17th, in a Facebook post responding to the conversation around Trump's comments, saying that there's no need for Taiwan to formally declare independence because Republic of China Taiwan is already a de facto independent sovereign state. So to bring it back to the Central European context real quick, for Central Europe, the Trump-Xi summit is not only about Taiwan. It is about American commitments that we can understand through this, that we can filter through this very Chinese lens of discourse power. Because if Washington appears willing to discuss Taiwan's security architecture with Beijing as a part of a broader bargain, for example, in terms of arms sales, countries in Central Europe can inevitably start asking whether the same transactional logic could one day apply to Ukraine or other parts of NATO's eastern flank. So, to conclude, the formal US policy might not have changed as a result of a single meeting, but perception matters. And in Central Europe, our deterrence also depends not only on treaties and troops, not only on the hardware, but also on whether Moscow will believe that Washington is politically serious. So in the Indo-Pacific, Beijing is effectively testing the very same thing.
And as this happens, we're seeing, in comparison, quite a different Donald Trump. When it comes to his China policy, in his first presidency, he's been quite flexing a muscle in terms of economic coercion, sanctions. Here, although there are tariffs imposed on China, the language and the ability to strike deals seems to be much softer approach on behalf of the U.S. president. He, what other commentators mentioned, also does not or did not respond to Xi Jinping's mention of the Thucydides trap and China as a rising power. Again, speaking of the discourse power, as you described, that this might have been considered a win or scoring points by Beijing, demonstrating that there is a challenge right in front of the eyes of the American president, to which he responded, or he didn't respond, or he responded by simply applauding Xi Jinping for all the things that Xi Jinping probably is, like a big man and maybe even a nice guy, as Donald Trump has put it, but definitely also a representative or a leader of an aggressive rival state on the world affairs. Furthermore, it looks like U.S. is striking some sort of deals with China, while European Union So considering Central Europe as part of the European Union's influence here, is preparing to have much more of economic statecraft of their own in a much more aggressive manner, meaning imposing some sectoral tariffs and trying to reposition itself towards China. After Trump's visit and all these deals being made, does it weaken the European Union hand? What's your take? Or does European Union policy, economic policy, doesn't matter that much regarding China global behavior?
Look, a lot of ink has been spilled about European inconsistency in trying to create an approach towards China. And as much as I hate to belay over the point, I think that we have to zoom in on these inconsistencies because they are an asset that China is effectively being able to use against us. When it comes to the EU's efforts to build its own economic statecraft or an effective response to China's economic statecraft, we see inconsistency between the 27 EU member states. For example, some of the member states like Spain under Sanchez have viewed China as a partner more than a rival or competitor, particularly amid growing strains in transatlantic relations. Other countries, particularly Central European countries on the eastern flank of NATO, together with some of their Nordic Baltic partners, have long understood that China is trying to meddle in our own national security affairs. We see it over and over in reports of intelligence services about negative security ramifications of potential investments by China in critical infrastructure, with examples like ports in Klaipeda or Gdynia. So there's this divergence at the level of member states, but we can also see divergence between Brussels-based institutions. So under the leadership of von der Leyen, already under the second term, the European Commission has really pushed for a more consistent economic security strategy for the European Union, sometimes inviting controversy given the division of responsibility between the EU and member states. To what extent can security, even if it's only economic security, become an EU controversy? This question becoming one drawing a lot of attention in the context of broader considerations of how much sovereignty should be afforded to EU institutions by the member states. But then at the same time, even though we see this perpetual hawkishness from von der Leyen and her second cabinet, the European Parliament has really emerged as a nodal institution for China's efforts to develop more amicability in its relations with Europe, particularly under the second Trump administration and the aforementioned strains in the transatlantic relations. So we are seeing growing magnitude of interaction between the European Parliament and Chinese lobbyists, whether in the form of the permanent mission of the People's Republic of China to the European Union or visiting delegations that meet at a very high level, for example, with the leadership of the European Parliament delegation for the relations with the PRC. So these inconsistencies will remain, and I believe that some actors within the European Union, particularly those that have already demonstrated a certain level of inclination to opening the door for China again, might use this summit as a sign that it is still okay to look at China as a viable economic partner. But again, at the end of the day, it was just a single meeting, and I don't think that it's going to rein in a major course correction, whether in Washington or in Brussels.
Hi, if you're enjoying this episode, why not subscribe to Visegrad Insight? This gives you access to all our latest content online, as well as to our live and online events. You can use our special promo code for Visegrad Insight podcast listeners to get 35% off. Just go to visegradinsight.eu, choose a yearly subscription, and apply code Visegrad35. And now, back to the podcast.
Now, let's focus with my last question on particular dilemma of Central Eastern Europe. It if that is true, although you say there are few ramifications from this very meeting itself, but if the general trend is going to be from the US of this transactional approach and ability to live, to not to honor the commitments that bring security to countries like Taiwan or to countries across Central Eastern Europe. And then there is more of a realization that economic statecraft must be shaped, and the European Union is the only platform on which Central Europe can act. Then looking at these two dilemmas of international relations and security and the economic statecraft itself, it leaves Central Europe puzzled even more, and some in Central Europe maybe reconsider the position on China towards Spain. Do you think that such a positive, like Spaniards are conducting? So do you consider such a scenario a likely scenario, or for various reasons you would say that is not going to be likely, and Central Europe has a completely different, altogether countries and leaders in Central Eastern Europe have altogether a different trajectory ahead already set?
Look, of course, our listeners are surely aware of heterogeneity that exists in foreign policies of Central European countries, and even within the context of V4, we will continue to see a lot of dynamism. We are looking with excitement at how Anita Orban is going to shape relations with both China and Taiwan after the momentous election in Hungary. There is an open question of how Fico's Slovakia is going to continue its economic engagements with China. There are different potential vectors in the Czech Republic with the eclectic coalition that buttresses the Babiš government. All that being said, I think that we need to look at the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that Europe at large, and Central European countries in particular, have already unequivocally recognized that stability in the Taiwan Strait matters directly to our own interests, our security and prosperity. The EU, at the level of the bloc and at the level of individual member states, has communicated clearly that it has a direct interest in preserving the status quo in the Taiwan Strait, which is consistent with the official policy of the Lai administration, and therefore opposes any changes to the status quo by force or coercion. So that language should now be matched by greater European political clarity. And this also matters economically. A Taiwan crisis would not only be a regional war confined to the Indo-Pacific theater, but rather a shock to strategic technologies, semiconductors, but also shipping, insurance, energy prices, European manufacturing by extension. So Central Europe's export-oriented economies would not be insulated from that. And Taiwan, under the concept of integrated diplomacy, which is the strategy delineated by current Foreign Minister Lin Jialong, has sought to simultaneously continue the more normative-based engagements with like-minded democratic partners, so continue the conversation on the importance of upholding the rule of law, integrity of democratic processes and institutions, and protection of human rights with partners like Central Europe, but also strongly emphasizes the more pragmatic and material dimension of the relationship. To this end, Taiwan can really position itself as a key partner for Central European economies in the establishment of so-called non-red supply chains for strategic technologies. And here, one particular technology that merits our attention are drones, UAVs. There is a lot of interaction, some facilitated by governments on both sides, but a lot happening more organically on a B2B basis between companies involved in the UAV supply chain on both sides. The advantage for Taiwan when engaging with Central European drone manufacturers is that Central European-made drones are often combat tested in Ukraine. And then the benefit for Europeans for engaging with Taiwan is that indeed, Taiwan can be a partner in building these China-free supply chains with components like light airframes, motors, optical solutions, AI software for the most cutting-edge UAV solutions. So this is just one practical example where, despite mixed messaging that we are seeing from the very top echelons of the Trump administration, there is space for Central Europe and Taiwan to engage very pragmatically, not only in normative terms, for the sake of upholding our shared security and prosperity.
Thank you, Marcin. I think we will soon be able to announce more of the findings of the report that you've been working on, and we've been preparing at Visegrad Insight on perspectives from Central Eastern Europe on different scenarios around Taiwan through the prism of economic security and economic statecraft. A lot indeed is coming up, but let's save it for another round and another podcast. But now, thank you very much for joining us to explain the significance of the Trump's visit to Beijing and meeting with Xi Jinping.
So I reiterate your invitation to our listeners to watch this space, and thanks again for having me to talk about this important summit.
And that's all from this week's episode of the Visegrad Insight podcast, bringing you the leading voices from Central Europe and on Central Europe.
Make sure to subscribe, and we'll be in touch next week.